There's something Sigmund Freud discovered over a century ago that modern psychology has quietly buried under layers of political correctness and academic sanitization. Something so fundamental to human desire and spirituality that once you understand it, you'll never look at your own motivations the same way again. And the worst part? Most people go their entire lives completely blind to it. What I'm about to tell you challenges everything you think you know about why you want what you want. Whether it's your career ambitions, your romantic choices, your spiritual beliefs, or even that nagging feeling that something's missing in your life, it all traces back to what Freud called the libido, but not in the way you think. When people hear the word libido, they immediately think sex. That's exactly the problem. We've allowed society to reduce one of the most comprehensive frameworks for understanding human motivation into a mere synonym for sexual desire. Freud understood something deeper, that the libido, this primal life force, doesn't just drive reproduction, it drives everything. Your spirituality, your ambitions, your deepest fears, and yes, your romantic and sexual desires. They're all expressions of the same underlying force seeking expression through different channels. Here's where it gets dark. Freud recognized that civilization is built on the sublimation of desire. Let me explain what that means because this is crucial. Sublimation isn't suppression, it's not about denying your desires, it's about redirecting that raw, primal energy into socially acceptable outlets. A man consumed by rage might become a boxer or a surgeon. A woman haunted by deep loneliness might pour herself into creating art or building a business. The spiritual mystic who claims to have transcended all worldly desires? He's sublimating his libido into spiritual practice. None of these people are free from desire. They've simply learned to channel it. But here's the dangerous truth that Freud knew, and that we've conveniently forgotten. When you sublimate desire without understanding what you're doing, you're not evolving. You're running. You're creating an elaborate psychological masquerade where the conscious mind believes one thing while the unconscious is screaming something completely different. This is where the neuroses begin. This is where the suffering starts. Think about the person who claims they don't need romantic love. They're too evolved for that, they say. They pour all their energy into spiritual practice, meditation, enlightenment. But watch them carefully. Notice the resentment when someone else finds partnership. Notice the subtle contempt for people in relationships. Notice how their spiritual practice becomes increasingly rigid and demanding. They're not spiritually advanced. They're running from rejection trauma and calling it transcendence. Their desire hasn't disappeared. It's been repressed, and repressed desire always finds a way to express itself, usually in destructive ways. Or consider the high-powered career woman who insists she doesn't need a man, that she's self-sufficient and fulfilled through her professional success. Again, I'm not saying this is always the case, but when you dig deeper, when you listen to the tone of her voice when she talks about relationships, when you see how she relates to men in her orbit, there's often a current of anger running underneath. She's not happy about not having a partner. She's rationalized her unmet needs into a philosophy. Her libido hasn't disappeared into her career. It's been repressed, turned inward, creating subtle psychological damage that manifests as contempt, perfectionism, or a cold approach to sexuality that treats it as a transaction rather than an intimate exchange. This is what Freud understood about the relationship between desire and spirituality. Most spiritual traditions, especially in the East, present enlightenment as the transcendence of desire. You meditate, you practice, you reach a state where you no longer want anything, and in that wanting nothing state, you find peace. But Freud would argue, and honestly, I think he's right, that what many spiritual practitioners are actually doing is achieving a dissociative state where they've convinced themselves they no longer want, while their unconscious is still burning with unmet needs. The problem with this approach is that it creates what we might call spiritual bypassing. You use your spiritual practice as a shield against facing the reality of your human desires. And when you do that, you're not actually evolving. You're fragmenting. Your psyche splits into the conscious spiritual self and the unconscious beast that still hungers, still lusts, still craves intimacy and recognition and power. Eventually, one of two things happens. Either the repressed desires explode in some catastrophic way, the celibate priest who molests children, the enlightened guru who exploits his disciples sexually, the spiritual teacher who creates a cult where he can finally act out his need for power, or the person becomes increasingly cold, disconnected, and psychologically fragmented. Now, let's talk about romantic and sexual desire specifically, because this is where the gender dynamics get really interesting and really dark. Freud had a concept called penis envy. And yes, I know how that sounds to modern ears. But hear me out, because he was pointing at something real, even if his terminology was crude. He was suggesting that women, in the process of developing their sexuality and sense of power in a male-dominated world, often internalize a sense of lack. They experience themselves as missing something that men have: social power, sexual agency, the ability to penetrate rather than be penetrated. The issue with Freud's formulation wasn't the core insight, it was the biological reductionism. He thought this was about literally lacking a penis. But what he was actually describing was the internalization of a power differential. In heterosexual dynamics, there's an inherent asymmetry. The man penetrates, the woman receives. The man's sexuality is external, obvious, and often celebrated. The woman's sexuality is interior, hidden, and historically pathologized. When a young girl becomes aware of this difference, she doesn't just notice anatomy, she notices power. Some women respond to this by fighting for external power, career achievement, professional dominance, sexual agency expressed through conquest or casual encounters. Others respond by internalizing the power differential and deriving pleasure from submission, from being desired, from being penetrated. Both are responses to the same fundamental recognition that in heterosexual dynamics, there's a structural inequality baked into the very act of intercourse. But here's where modern psychology gets confused and where most people are completely blind. These aren't free choices made from a place of authenticity. They're adaptive responses to a power dynamic. And when you fail to recognize that, when you pretend that a woman's desire to be sexually submissive is just her authentic preference, or conversely, that a woman's obsession with career dominance has nothing to do with compensating for sexual vulnerability, you're missing a crucial psychological reality. Let me be clear, I'm not saying that submissive desires are wrong or that career ambition is a neurosis. What I'm saying is that until you understand the root of your desire, you're being controlled by it rather than choosing it. The woman who doesn't understand why she needs a man to complete her will endlessly seek men to complete her, attracting manipulators and abusers in the process. The woman who doesn't understand that her fierce independence is partly a defense against vulnerability will inevitably struggle with intimacy, finding herself attracting emotionally unavailable men who mirror her own avoidance. The same applies to men, just inverted. A man who bases his entire sense of self-worth on sexual conquest is compensating for deep insecurity. A man who rejects sexuality entirely in favor of spiritual practice is usually running from his own fear of inadequacy or rejection. A man who seeks emotional merging with a woman is often trying to recapture the symbiotic relationship he had with his mother. These aren't philosophical choices, they're psychological patterns, and this is where Freud's insight about spirituality becomes so relevant. Because many people use spirituality, whether it's meditation practice, religious devotion, or New Age philosophy, as a way to escape these uncomfortable truths about their desires. They say, I'm beyond all that. I've transcended sexuality and gender. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. But what they're really doing is repressing the entire domain of desire and embodiment. They're using spirituality as a sophisticated defense mechanism. The truly evolved person, and this is crucial, isn't the one who has transcended desire. It's the one who has made conscious what was unconscious. It's the person who understands why they want what they want, who recognizes the roots of their desires in their childhood, their trauma, their internalized social conditioning, and their fundamental drives for survival, reproduction, and social power. Once you have that understanding, you can choose differently. You can engage with your desires from a place of awareness rather than compulsion. This is the dark truth that Freud knew, that most of human civilization, most of our culture, most of our spirituality is built on a massive repression of desire. We've created elaborate philosophical and religious systems to justify not having what we deeply want. We call it enlightenment, we call it evolution, we call it transcendence. But it's repression with a better marketing department. Consider the relationship landscape. Most people are in relationships because they're terrified of being alone. They've internalized the message that being in a couple is the ultimate marker of success and acceptability. So they settle. They stay with partners who treat them poorly because the alternative, facing their own loneliness, their own fear of abandonment, their own terror of being unlovable, feels unbearable. But they can't admit this. So instead, they construct narratives. "I love him," they say, when what they really mean is, "I'm terrified of the alternative." "We're soulmates," they claim, when what they mean is, "We're both too damaged to leave." The sexual dynamics that emerge from this are toxic. If a woman is staying in a relationship primarily because she fears abandonment, her sexuality becomes a tool of control or appeasement rather than an expression of genuine desire. She performs desire when she doesn't feel it. She suppresses desire when she does feel it if it threatens the stability of the relationship. Her body becomes a site of negotiation rather than pleasure, and she's often completely unconscious of this. She thinks she's in love. She thinks she's being a good partner. She doesn't realize she's in psychological bondage. Similarly, a man who is in a relationship primarily because he fears loneliness or because he needs a woman to regulate his emotional state will approach sexuality with the same underlying anxiety. His sexuality becomes desperate, possessive, or aggressive, or it becomes withdrawn and cold as a defense against the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. Again, he's unconscious of this pattern. He thinks his relationship struggles are about his partner not understanding him, or being too demanding, or not being attractive enough. This is where gender becomes crucial to understanding the dark truth of desire, because men and women face different socialization around desire from birth. A young boy is encouraged to want, to pursue, to conquer, to dominate. His sexuality is presented as natural and inevitable. A young girl, conversely, is taught to be wanted rather than to want. Her sexuality is presented as something dangerous that needs to be controlled. She learns to manage male desire rather than express her own. These aren't just cultural messages. They become neurological patterns. They become the structure of the psyche itself. A man can often access his desire easily because he's been socialized to express it. But he often struggles with genuine intimacy because that requires vulnerability and receptivity, qualities that are coded as feminine and therefore forbidden to him. A woman, conversely, can often access intimate connection relatively easily, but struggles to own her own desire because she's been trained to see her sexuality through the eyes of others rather than through her own felt experience. Freud understood this at some level, even if he couldn't articulate it in modern language. He knew that the psyche is fundamentally split. There's the conscious self that we present to the world, the one that follows the rules, that achieves success, that maintains relationships. And then there's the unconscious self, the one that hungers, that craves, that wants things we've deemed unacceptable. Most people never resolve this split. They just maintain an uneasy truce between the two parts, with the conscious mind remaining mostly unaware of what the unconscious is doing. The spiritual person who claims to have transcended desire, they're not resolving the split. They're choosing one side and pretending the other doesn't exist. They're privileging the conscious mind's values and goals while denying the validity of the unconscious drives. This creates a psychological time bomb, because the unconscious doesn't go away. It just goes underground. It expresses itself in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in mysterious illnesses, in sudden explosive behaviors that seem completely out of character. This is why so many spiritual leaders fall from grace. They've built their entire identity on the transcendence of desire. They've convinced themselves and their followers that they've achieved some state beyond human need. But they haven't transcended desire, they've repressed it. And when that repression finally breaks, it breaks catastrophically. The revered guru who was discovered in a sexual abuse scandal. The beloved spiritual teacher who abandoned his practice and his values for a secret affair. The enlightened monk who committed suicide after a lifetime of celibacy. These aren't failures of individual character. They're predictable outcomes of a repression-based approach to the psyche. Now, I need to be careful here because I'm not saying that monogamy is neurotic or that spiritual practice is inherently damaging. What I'm saying is that when these choices, commitment to a partner or commitment to a spiritual path, are made from a place of unconsciousness, from a place of running away from something rather than moving towards something, they become prisons rather than paths. The person who chooses long-term commitment to a partner from a place of full consciousness, understanding their own attachment patterns, their abandonment fears, their need for security, and choosing partnership anyway, eyes wide open, that person is making an evolved choice. But that's rare. Most people choose partnership as a way to escape themselves, and the resulting relationships are characterized by a subtle but pervasive dishonesty. The couple presents themselves as happily partnered when the reality is codependency and fear-based bonding. The person who chooses spiritual practice from a place of genuine curiosity and growth, someone who uses meditation and philosophy to understand themselves more deeply, to work with their conditioning, to develop compassion, that person is on a genuine path. But that's also rare. Most people use spirituality as a sophisticated escape hatch. They use it to bypass the hard work of psychological integration. Here's the key insight that Freud kept pointing at. You cannot transcend what you have not fully acknowledged and integrated. If you're using spirituality or career achievement or romantic partnership to escape your desires, you haven't transcended anything. You've just repressed it more effectively. The work, the real psychological work, is to bring the unconscious into consciousness. To look directly at what you want, why you want it, where it comes from, and what it means about you as a human being. This is threatening work. Because once you see the truth about your desires, you can't unsee it. The comfortable narratives collapse. The spiritual bypass no longer works. The romantic fantasy about your partner shatters. You're left facing yourself directly, and what you see is often humbling and sometimes horrifying. You see your own pettiness, your own need for validation, your own craving for power, your own sexual hungers that don't fit the image you've constructed of yourself. But here's the liberation on the other side of that confrontation. Once you fully acknowledge what you want, you can actually choose whether to pursue it or not. The person who admits that she wants a man, not because she's weak, but because she's human, and because connection matters to her, can make conscious choices about what kind of man and what kind of relationship she actually wants, rather than settling for whoever will have her. The person who admits that he's terrified of abandonment can work on healing that wound rather than endlessly repeating relationship patterns that guarantee the abandonment he fears. This is where the intersection of desire and spirituality becomes interesting, because genuine spiritual practice isn't about denying your desires or transcending your humanity. It's about becoming more fully human. It's about developing the awareness and the capacity to hold your desires without being controlled by them. The Buddhist meditator who sits with craving and watches it arise and pass without grasping or rejecting it, that's consciousness work. But the Buddhist who uses meditation to convince himself that he no longer craves anything, that's just sophisticated repression. The same applies to gender and sexuality. True evolution in how we relate across gender lines isn't about transcending sexuality or pretending that power differentials don't exist. It's about bringing them into full consciousness. It's about a man understanding his own fear of vulnerability and his socialized need to dominate, and then choosing to show up differently with the women in his life. It's about a woman understanding her own fear of powerlessness and her learned tendency to use sexuality as a bargaining chip, and then choosing to own her sexuality fully. This brings us to the real dark truth that Freud knew but couldn't fully articulate in the language of his time. Most of human suffering, certainly most relationship suffering, most sexual suffering, most spiritual seeking, comes from the same root. We're all trying to meet primitive psychological needs through sophisticated social channels, and we're not aware we're doing it. The career ambition is really a hunger for recognition and dominance. The spiritual practice is really a flight from shame and failure. The romantic attachment is really a recreation of the early symbiosis with the mother or father. None of this is wrong. These are all legitimate ways of channeling human desire. The problem arises only when we're unconscious of what we're doing, when we pretend that our behavior is motivated by something lofty when it's actually motivated by something primal. When we use ideology, spiritual, political, psychological, to justify unconscious patterns. The person who finally sees this clearly, who understands that their spirituality is partly a flight mechanism, that their career ambition is partly compensation for early wounds, that their romantic choices are partly repetitions of family patterns, that person has taken the first step toward actual psychological freedom. Not the freedom that comes from transcending desire, which is impossible, but the freedom that comes from understanding desire and making conscious choices about it. This is the work that Freud was pointing toward. Not psychoanalysis as a way to endlessly process your past, but as a way to bring unconscious patterns into consciousness so that you can then choose differently. Not therapy as a path to happiness, because acknowledging the full truth about your desires and your patterns often makes you less happy in the short term, but as a path to authenticity, to being more fully yourself rather than a carefully constructed performance of who you think you should be. And the irony, the delicious irony that Freud would have appreciated, is that when people finally do the real work of understanding their desires, when they stop running and start facing themselves directly, they often find that their desires are actually more evolved than the philosophical systems they were using to deny those desires. The woman who thought she needed to be perpetually independent discovers that she actually wants partnership and finds that wanting it doesn't diminish her. The man who thought he needed to be constantly strong and invulnerable discovers that he actually wants emotional connection and finds that his vulnerability is a source of strength, not weakness. The spiritual seeker who thought transcendence meant negating the body discovers that genuine awakening includes the body, sexuality, and human desire as legitimate and beautiful expressions of being alive. But this only happens if you're willing to look directly at what you actually want, without judgment, without ideology, without the spiritual bypass. That's the dark truth that Freud knew. That's the understanding that can liberate you if you're brave enough to pursue it. The question is, are you ready to stop lying to yourself about what you want?